I have received a letter from the honourable member for Deakin proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the housing crisis facing Australians and this government's failure to respond effectively. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places and give the call to the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, in the litany of failures of this government, I think the biggest failure and the biggest area of neglect and misunderstanding from this government is in relation to housing. Mr Speaker, the government has no agenda in housing, and if you want to be generous, and say that their failed Housing Australia Future Fund, the Ponzi scheme money-go-round, is an agenda, then that agenda is in absolute tatters. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the housing minister, the hapless housing minister, gets up and tries to say that somehow housing has improved under the Labor government. Now, I think it's pretty clear to Australians that that's not the truth. But if you look at every single measure since this government has been in office, housing has gone backwards for Australians. New home starts between the March quarter of 22 and 23 is down by nearly 7%. New home approvals are down by nearly 16% compared to this time last year. New home sales are down by nearly 40%. First home buyers are at their lowest levels since the Gillard government, and of course, people who are renting are paying on average 11.5% more this year than last. So on every single measure for ordinary Australians, housing is going backwards. Now, what do we hear from the government? As I said, if we want to be generous and call their Ponzi scheme money go round, the Housing Australia Future Fund, an agenda, the only thing they want to discuss is the fact that they want to build 30,000 homes over 5 years. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that promise from the government. Firstly, if you look at the fund, they're saying that they can build each house for $83,000. $83,000 per home. So 30,000 homes at the princely sum of $83,000 a home. Now, I will go to my electorate and I can assure members opposite that people in my electorate would say, we would love one of those, an $83,000 home. But secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, even if we accept this promise of 30,000 homes over 5 years, that's 6,000 homes a year, hardly an agenda that would get too many people excited, certainly hasn't got the Senate very excited. Over that same period, the government wants to bring in 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people over that 5-year period, and their great answer to their Big Australia, remember Kevin Rudd's Big Australia? Well, Kevin Rudd's Big Australia is back. It's back, and it's real under this government, is don't fear Australians at the 1.5 million people that are coming. We've got a plan to house them. We're going to build 30,000 homes for those 1.5 million people. I mean, it is quite comical that if you want to call it an agenda, that is the housing agenda of this government. But for Australians out there, as I said, renters who are paying 11.5% on average more, it's 12.9% for people in Sydney, it's 13% for people in my home city of Melbourne, it's 16% in Perth. For them, they don't laugh. They don't laugh because they see those additional 1.5 million migrants with no plan to build more housing as just further increases in their rent. Now, the other thing we don't hear from this government is anything about first home buyers. You do not hear a word out of this hapless housing minister about first home buyers. There's no surprise that first home buyers are now down to levels we have not seen since the Gillard government. New home purchases are down nearly 40%. So the sad thing for Australians is that because new home starts are down, because new home purchases are down, that we actually haven't seen the worst of it. The Prime Minister has the gall to talk about supply at that dispatch box, and yet supply is dropping. Supply has dropped off the edge of a cliff, and yet we're seeing nothing from this government, no action whatsoever. Madam Deputy Speaker, it would be remiss to have a housing MPI and not discuss what I think are the forgotten Australians at the moment. And the forgotten Australians are people with a mortgage. People with a mortgage under this government are paying nearly $1,900 a month more in interest repayments. How much? Nearly $1,900 a month more in interest repayments. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this Prime Minister promised before the election that he would deliver cheaper mortgages. Well, again I say, where are those cheaper mortgages? Who's got one of those cheaper mortgages? Do any of the members opposite have one of those cheaper mortgages that they could tell us about? I invite those members of the government who are going to speak on this MPI to outline who on earth has one of these cheaper mortgages that the Prime Minister promised before the election. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I say that there's no agenda from this government, and I say if you want to be very generous and call the Ponzi scheme money go round an agenda, I'm probably being a bit hard on the government, because the government did promise before the election, they did promise their Help to Buy scheme. And I can't say I was particularly excited about that, and I don't think many Australians were excited at the prospect of having the Australian government owning a portion of their home and having the Prime Minister figuratively at the kitchen table with them. But they did take it to an election. They did take it to an election, and I'm looking at my phone now because, well, it's the 8th of August. And the Help to Buy scheme was promised to start on the 1st of January. The 1st of January 2023. The 1st of January 2023. So every time the Prime Minister's asked about his so-called promise around cheaper mortgages, he sort of says, well, no, I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about our Help to Buy scheme. Where is it? It's 8 months late. What on earth has this housing minister been doing? This hapless housing minister who can't even show up in the chamber for this MPI and defend her woeful legacy. I can understand why the minister wouldn't want to show her face in this chamber with the record that she's got, but she should at least front up and try and put up some sort of paltry defence, because what we see from this government is priorities that are not aligned with Australians. And I can assure the House and I can assure the members of the government that we are absolutely committed to making sure that every single Australian has a realistic prospect of owning their home. The government's waved the white flag. The government has given up. The government has said we'll build 6,000 homes over 5 years while we bring in 1.5 million people as their great answer. But on this side of the House, we are saying to every single Australian, we will be doing everything we possibly can to give you the greatest opportunity to own your home. We cannot, as a generation, accept younger Australians looking forward to their career and their life and getting married and having children and giving up on that opportunity that every generation before them has had, and that is to own a home. This government has sold you out. This government has forgotten about you. But I assure those Australians that the Liberal and National parties are just as committed to home ownership now as we ever have been. Just as committed. Now, the Help to Buy scheme was supposed to start on the 1st of July. I want to give the government some credit. I want to give them some credit. In recent times, they have tried to take some credit for the Coalition's Home Guarantee Scheme. Congratulations for continuing the vastly successful Home Guarantee Scheme, helping people buy a home with a deposit of as little as 5%, helping single parents, 85% of which are single mothers, purchase a home with a 2% deposit. But guess what? You can't just run off the fumes of the former government forever. You've got to come up with some policy and deal with the challenges in front of Australians. Because if you're renting, you're worse off. If you're saving for a new home, you're worse off. If you've got a mortgage now, you're worse off. Every single Australian is suffering because of the neglect and the lack of plan from this government, and I can assure those Australians that the Liberal and National parties have not given up on you.